Welcome, everybody. My name is Donnie Maclurcan. I'm a co-founder of the Post-Growth Institute. Delighted to be here with you in these challenging moments worldwide over the last years, decades, centuries, millennia, and hours. And I'm particularly delighted to be joined in this opening panel with a stellar cast of really outstanding human beings from all around the world. We have two people who are going to be joining us in the video stream, so I'll introduce those in just a moment, and then we have two people here on stage. We have about 90 minutes for this panel, and the way things are going to look is we will have opening statements from our guests. We will then have a chance for them to reflect on each other's comments. You'll have a chance to reflect on anything you'd like to be asking. We'll have some more discussion here, and then move to a Q&A with the audience, both here with us in person and to those of you who are watching online. But to the guests today, first I'd like to introduce Dr. Lebohang Liepollo Pheko, who is the Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at the Trade Collective think tank, who is joining us today virtually, and I think will be up on our screens in just a moment. Next to me here, I have Dr. Irene Vélez Torres, who is the former Minister of Mines and Energy in Colombia. And next to Dr. Torres, we have Dr. Claudia Hiepe, who is the Deputy Head of Division Environmental Policy, Biodiversity, Forests, Marine Conservation with the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. And then also joining us online, we have Professor Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN's Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. So please join me in making these four wonderful guests welcome. So, Dr. Torres, you acted as Minister for Mines and Energy of Colombia until July 2023. That was a position crucial for any, again, so-called just transition towards a sustainable economy. Can you elaborate on the model of economic development that you pursued in your work as part of the Colombian government?
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I think in order to understand what we aimed in terms of the new just energy transition model as part of the first left wing in Colombian history, it is important to address what kind of models we had before. And I will start by saying or characterizing two main features of that model. On the one hand, during 200 years after the independence of Colombia, we have developed what we have called an extractivist governmentality, which means that the institutions and all the policy setting was particularly based on the extraction of very carbon-intensive commodities. And all our economy has been based on that, which doesn't mean that we are a very particularly rich country in terms of fossil fuels, as, for example, Venezuela can be, or other countries that are a lot more efficient in that kind of production, but our economy is absolutely dependent on exporting those commodities. So that's the history, and the institutions have been made for that to happen. So one thing that we faced when starting the government was the change of the institutions in terms of the culture, but also all the legal settings. And that cannot be done in 1 year or 2 years. And we are now facing the difficulties of being able to do it in 4 years, because it's 200 years of legacy that is basically framing the decision-making opportunities that we have in terms of the economic model. Now, on the other side, there is also like the material dependency that we have created. So it's not only the legal system, but also the economic models in place. And this does not only mean that the national economy in their numbers is dependent on those commodities, but also the local economies. So when you go to a mining area or an oil-producing area, local communities will be there also defending the extractivist model, because it's very difficult after 30 years of having been participating in those industries just to imagine that something else is possible. Even if they have histories on some peasantry or some small-scale local sustainable production, the 30 years of implementation of a very well-established industry, extractive industry, makes it very difficult to transition at a local scale. So the challenge there is that the change had to happen in many different layers at the same time, and also accounting with the very violent opposition by the traditional elites. So, and I think this is not to be undermined, because the elites have been ruling throughout the 200 years that I just mentioned, and to destabilize that power and that hegemony, which is political as it is economical, it's something that is resisted violently. So we had to face all that, trying to at the same time establish, first of all, a new idea of what the national economy and the local economies could be, and to make the first steps in terms of a new policy and a new law setting. We try to approach the change basically by doing two things simultaneously. On the one hand, the president, since the campaign, decided that no fossil fuel was going to be promoted during this government, which meant that we suspended all new contracts for oil and gas exploration and exploitation, which is a huge decision in this context of dependency of the exports of those commodities, and at the same time, not new areas or new mining titles were going to be granted for coal exploitation. So that gave us like a big of a battle area, but at the same time, a very radical decision that clearly showed the commitment that the government had for sustainability, for climate justice, and for a transition in an economic model. However, where were we going to transition to? That's always more difficult to decide. So the idea was to transition to 4 new productive areas: agriculture, tourism, industrialization, and green energy. And here, I think we can discuss a lot more of what are the challenges in those areas, because it's not only to have or to phase out fossil fuels in our understanding of the complexities of the challenges that are coming with the planetary crisis, is also to address that planetary crisis from the perspective of water footprints and the whole ecological dimensions that are coming with extractivism. So we know that, for example, tourism can also be extractivist. And we know that agriculture, if it is done in the same monoculture, large scale form or feature, it's gonna bring all that water and a carbon footprint. So we know that this is not free of environmental conflicts and is not free of the discussion about growth at the end. But we still needed to make a very clear position about where were we standing in terms of the climate crisis That was clear. And then we had to solve it more internally in terms of where and how we were going to replace the economy, the national economy and local economy generated in those traditional extractive industries. And I will leave you with that, and in the discussion we can continue about the challenges.
Thank you so much, Dr. Torres, for that nuanced perspective. Let's just check back in to see how we're doing. Any luck with Dr. Pheko?
It's really great to be here. I thoroughly enjoyed the first speaker's remarks, and I'd like to pick up exactly where she left off. So I think in response to your questions, Donnie, I think it's one of the things that we have thought in our own work at the Trade Collective and in some of the other formations that I'm a part of, is that growth is part of the work that we critique and we examine, but we also recognize that we need far more fluidity in the way that we frame what growth is. So many questions: growth for whom, growth towards what, development for whom, development towards what, just transition, just for whom, and in fact, what is justicial or justice-related transition or transformation. And I think the one thing is to name that we have deep concerns about the assumptions that one form of economic growth is the primary and most effective mechanism for measuring societal prosperity, societal flourishing, and societal forward movement. And then the other is to mention that growth in abstraction is, of course, it's allowed a very toxic and narrowly problematic social and development matrix of indicators to be the pervasive default for humanity. And of course, it negates historically extractive practices and the way that these practices are continuously reenacted through institutions like the Bretton Woods arrangements, and that the default to austerity, which is deeply racialized and has deeply asymmetric policy practices, is an illustration of this. So that the industrialization of poverty, the industrialization of growth, rather than thinking of it on a philosophical and a much more heterodox level. And in addition to this, the constructs of non-financialized, non-monetized, and non-economic growth trajectories also need to be foregrounded. And I'm sure we're going to say a bit more about that later on in the discussions around the alternatives to this form of growth, this narrow form of growth dogma, different alternatives to the GDP, for example. And in addition to this, we also argue that the growth discourse requires us to include a reparational and restorative elements that begin to acknowledge the historical debt that has led to the current regional asymmetries and develop a more redistributive model of societal functioning. And this is a whole menu of possibilities, including rethinking aid, rethinking global economic architecture, and so on. Now, I think another thing here is that we need to think around the overwhelming drive to catch up. And I think this is where the development discourse in many respects is deeply insufficient. So when we think about development, that should really be read as catching up to a particular northern-centric paradigm, whereas we need to be thinking around development which recognizes and is centered in a multipolar world, which recognizes the historical and the historical elements that I have spoken about, but also that is aligned with the developmentist and the structuralist perspective that can equate development with structural transformation and systemic transformation rather than just development for the sake of it. I have said in previous comments and previous webinars that I've been part of that we really need to think about developing towards what and towards whose standards. And I've also said that in many respects, as countries and as nation states, we are all in different states of development, different forms of development, hopefully developing towards greater forms of humanity, greater egalitarianism, greater forms of economic development and economic democracy, growing towards and away from the racialized, gendered toxicities that mark the kind of economic relations that we see in this moment. Now, as you rightly say, we have a deep interest at the Trade Collective in new forms and multiple forms of internationalism. And I think that this is probably a good moment to remind us that the right to development, for example, was at some stage something that seemed almost inevitable. And a memorable example of how more industrialized, read that as global north or minority world countries, have often been quite discouraging of alternative and multipolar southern-led visions for development or global economic growth is one that's seen in the 1974 General Assembly Declaration on the New International Economic Order that was extremely prescriptive and extremely condemnatory of global South alternatives. So we need to really rethink the ways in which power is redistributed and develop towards far more egalitarian power in the way that economic processes are managed and co-created and co-imagined. Linked to this, of course, is also the notion of this highly uneven effects across the North-South divides to function and sustain and reproduce, particularly inequities and inequalities across global trade and development, with all the problematics that I've mentioned. And this really needs us to speak to questions of trust, what inclusive and collective action means, and what neutrality means in a multipolar world where we have decentered power from the global north and diffused it across different global points. And it also speaks to more egalitarian norms, and that are supported by a trusted, more accountable state, and I quote there. So rather than decentering this global South-North or North-South framework, however we want to put it, it might be more analytically useful, in our view, for the whole growth and development discourse to seek to recenter the majority world or the global South, and to use the lenses of the people, the countries, the economic agents who are the most peripheralized and the most dispossessed, the most marginalized, in order to then understand the global political economy a bit more thoughtfully. And this process of recentering the global South does not mean decentering the global North, but it does mean that the world has to become somewhat flattened in the way that our economic relationships are then rebuilt. And this also means that the structural imbalances that function to reproduce the North-South divide, their historic origins, must remain foregrounded. So while the world no longer consists, for the most part, of explicit colonies, explicit colonial powers, there are multiple aspects of the global economy which reproduce similar geographies of power, of influence, and of insubordination. It's really important to then rethink and to recategorize capitalist development as historically constituted, and I'm quoting, politically implicated and culturally calibrated. And I'm quoting from an article that I co-wrote for the Development and Change Journal, was published last year. And I think just to speak to your point, Donnie, on just transition as well. It's, again, deeply contested, and I'm in the middle of co-writing a bit of with a couple of good colleagues of mine, scholar activists, exactly on that. Because on the one hand, when we think about a just transition, we often think about something that has become incredibly amorphous, nebulous in its languaging, and deeply depoliticized. And it sort of like means everything and nothing, a just transition. And it keeps on begging the question, just for who? Transitioning towards what? And for me, it begs the same kind of question as developing towards what? And it seems to reproduce the same kind of problematics. But I think that in this, my good colleague has reminded me, in fact, that this concept was actually, again, like many things, it originates in the majority world, in the global South. And it was actually, of course, it's not only is it an attempt to align climate and energy objectives with the material concerns of industrial workers, frontline communities, and marginalized group, it is actually, in some respects, it's sometimes been called a form of climate delayism, which is also quite tricky. But it really rather speaks to the heart of what it means to advocate for a justice-related transition. I'd rather say a justice-aligned transition or transformation. So, for example, does it require new forms of polity, new forms of political sovereignty? Is that national or is it regional? And when we think around the ways in which growth has been utilized and instrumentalized and turned into a universal single indicator or single index as exemplified by the GDP, that does a great disservice back to the diversity of 8 billion people who are all having all completely diverse experiences and lived experiences on this planet that we share, and we are forced to share. It also does a great disservice to the many nodes of different kinds of power, knowledge, wisdom, governance that are indigenous to different parts of the world. So when we're thinking around sovereignty and the multiple sovereignties, it seems that a justice-aligned transition or transformation must move further towards these multiple sovereignties. And then we think around things around the movements from below and structural transformation. So I think I'll leave it there for this round, and I'm happy to take questions and later on in the discussion. Thank you, Donnie and other colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pheko, for this invitation, this reminder, these explorations here to seek to explore ourselves. Where is the capture of these asymmetries you're describing? Thank you for centering the power dynamics and so much more for us. Moving to our next speaker here, Dr. Hiepe. What role does the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ, ascribe to economic growth in its strategy on economic development, and how, if at all, is that role changing? And feel free to provide any specific examples you might feel that are relevant.
Yeah, thank you, Donnie, for this question, and welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a more specific questions, because it's not about the overall vision of BMZ. It's specifically on our strategy on economic development and how we see economic growth there. And let me start with saying that, of course, BMZ recognizes that we need this fundamental shift in transformation of our economic systems, and that our strategy on economic development is, of course, guided by the vision of a socio-ecological transformation of the economy and ultimately, also the society. And what does that mean for us? It means making a shift towards economic systems that are socially just and environmentally sustainable. It means a combination of reducing poverty, pushing back hunger, fostering economic development, and also the decent jobs agenda, but also enabling the economy to play a key role in addressing the planetary crises, in of course, acknowledging the planetary boundaries and actually preserving also the physical foundations of economic activity. So I think what has changed already in the last years is that resilience is a key motivation. So we need resilient economies, and this is also a resilient cornerstone for resilient societies. What is also, and of course, speaking for BMZ, our mandate is focused on the global south. But of course, we are also in the processes of the German government, so that we have a decisive role in making trade flows sustainable through advocacy and implementation support for supply chain regulations. For example, of course, we are also engaging in the EU regulations like the one on deforestation-free value chains, etc. But the question was, what about economic growth? So what? And of course, this I really wanted to be here, also knowing that I will be maybe facing some difficulties because the BMZ position is clearly also mainly oriented towards green and inclusive growth. And this is also because we actually think that economic growth is needed in many developing countries to fulfill basic needs for all. So because there are inequalities persisting, yes, and I know many say this is exactly the result, and it is a result of the economic systems we are having. But when we face, for example, in the energy sector, 760 million people without access to electricity, for other example, on health, in sub-Saharan Africa, 4 out of 5 people without adequate access to health services and social security systems. And also, of course, there has been improvement, but also in agriculture, still 9% of the global population facing hunger in 2023. So we think there we need, in some sectors, economic growth will be inevitable, but of course it has to be inclusive and green. And of course there is this debate, and we're also having this debate within BMZ and with our partners. Will it be enough? Yeah, for the achieving Paris goals, for achieving the global biodiversity framework goals, and of course also have to see that BMZ has also a long history of supporting alternative economic approaches, many of them actually locally. Yeah, so and many of them as part of bilateral cooperation, governmental cooperation, for example, decades of supporting cooperatives for farmers on marketing, consumer cooperatives, but also projects with non-state actors on solidarity economy. So there are many of these examples, and of course also this conference is financed by BMZ. So we do like this discussion. We also actually do highly appreciate that the UN system has put the Beyond GDP agenda so much at the forefront. That is something we also have been supporting for a long time, especially as a subset, no? I think of the Beyond Growth agenda is the Beyond GDP agenda. And I can maybe also later on give some examples. We support the Changing Wealth of Nations report from the World Bank, is financed by BMZ, etc. So there are many of those examples too. And we do, whenever, like the UN, no, there's the UN Year of Cooperatives next year. I think these are also elements, they are part of the Beyond GDP agenda. At the same time, for us, green and economic green and inclusive growth is still very much also at the center of our economic development strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hiepe, particularly for outlining the mandate that you have with BMZ around green growth, and for still being willing to entertain conversations around post-growth, degrowth, etc., alternatives, or as Dr. Pheko was saying, multiple sovereignties, different perspectives on these pieces from different parts of the world. We'll now turn to Professor de Schutter, who is joining us on the road there. Welcome, thank you for being with us. Professor de Schutter, you are an outspoken critic of the view that economic growth is the key to poverty alleviation. At the same time, as UN Special Rapporteur, you are part of the United Nations system with its great variety of organizations that follow different conceptions of economic development. What views on economic growth do you see as dominant within the UN system, and where do you see the most fertile ground for beyond growth shifts occurring in these conceptions?
Thank you, Donnie. And first of all, let me apologize for not being able to be there in person, and moreover to having to speak from a train, as you may see on your screen. Let me answer directly your question. I think there has been for many years a dominant view as to how poverty should be addressed. And that view is that poverty is to be addressed by a three-step sequence in which we grow the economy first. We then, number two, tax corporations and the wealthiest households. And then step three is we ensure a form of redistribution by financing public services and social protection. And I think this understanding of how to combat poverty is a constraint on political imagination. It makes the fight against poverty dependent on growing the economy, despite the fact that many tools that we've been using traditionally to grow the economy have actually been counterproductive, resulting in the privatization of the commons, resulting in a business-friendly investment climate being created, which in fact means reducing taxes on corporations and removing the regulatory burdens on the ability to do business, resulting in trade liberalization and investment liberalization policies that have not always, far from that, benefited people in poverty. And so we need to be much more imaginative. And what I'm trying to do indeed with other elements of the UN system is to identify how we can reimagine the fight against poverty without being hostage to the need to create economic growth. And that means targeting how the market works, in other terms, moving beyond post-market measures that compensate the losers from how the economy functions, towards reforming the economy itself in order to make it more inclusive and to ensure that each individual has equal chances of succeeding in the economy, and then adopting free market measures with a focus on early childhood education and care, and breaking the vicious cycles that perpetuate poverty from one generation to the next. And I think we have to expand our toolbox in the fight against poverty in order to be less dependent on growth as a precondition for anything else, whether it consists in improving or reducing our ecological footprint, or whether it consists in reducing poverty. And so my work with other parts of the UN is to do precisely that. I would say that the Beyond GDP agenda is a small part of that agenda. But the big risk today is that adopting alternative indicators of progress, as recommended, for example, in Action 53 of the Pact for the Future, that refers to the need to develop indicators of social development beyond GDP and that complement GDP, is that this becomes a substitute for the changes we need to bring to the economy itself. And that instead of changing the way we produce and consume and the way we think about trade, investment, and taxation, we just change the indicators we're using without drawing the consequences therefrom. A bit like if you drive a car and you realize that you're moving too fast and that your fuel tank is almost empty, well, you continue, although registering that you will arrive at a cliff and that you will fall out of gas. And I think we need something more than just develop new indicators of progress. That is the easiest to achieve. That is what we have a consensus about. But all the rest, which is the inertia of a system that is premised on growth being the precondition for social progress, all that still needs to be changed. And so my objective in the next year is to build an alliance between think tanks, NGOs, unions, civil servants, UN agencies around post-growth alternatives. That doesn't mean necessarily degrowth. I'm actually agnostic about how the GDP evolves and whether it increases or decreases. It all depends how we calculate GDP and what grows and what does not grow in a particular economy. But what I'm not agnostic about is the need to reduce our ecological footprint and to reduce inequalities and poverty. And we can do a lot without depending on GDP growth. That is the agenda. And I hope, Donnie, I answered your question.
You did. You did. Thank you so much for sharing that about that call to expand the toolbox and raising again some of this nuance around language and agnosticism versus support for particular languaging paradigms, etc. I'm hoping that Dr. Pheko will be able to join us. She just messaged me saying her Wi-Fi just crashed, so we'll see if she can join us in just a moment. But for now, we're going to take 20 seconds of silence. We've heard from all of our speakers. This is a chance for you to reflect and for our speakers to reflect on what's been heard. And then I'm going to return to the speakers for a chance to share any follow-ups from things that might have sparked some commentary that they'd like to share with each other. But for now, we're just going to take 20 seconds of silence so that we can all have a chance to reflect. Thank you. I will add, taking a little liberty here with my moderator role, that my encouragement is that in more of these spaces we do take a little more time to reflect. There's often part of that growth narrative that is more, and a little plug for slowing down and taking a moment to be part of that world that we're seeking that is a little slower in terms of its directives. So I'll hand over to any of the panelists that feel drawn to share any follow-ups here, and hopefully Dr. Pheko will rejoin us. But for now, is anyone feeling they'd like to follow up on something they've heard from anyone here, or maybe it's prompted some new perspectives? Yes, Dr. Torres.
I would like to share a few first reactions in relation to two different ideas that were shared just before. One is about the inertia of the system and what does it mean to actually govern a country within that inertia. Because some of the biggest challenges that we had when we entered the government was how to frame the new objectives within systems. And when I am saying systems, is databases and variables that are there and that we had to follow in order to, for example, demonstrate that we were executing the budget. So it's super difficult to change the variables from one day to another. It has actually passed 2 years and we haven't been able to change the variables. So things as simple as, for example, we were considering that one particular implementation of a program shouldn't be measured through individual achievement or successful or implementation, but collective. It was impossible to change it in the system. And that's just minimum. That's not even GDP. So how do we reframe governmentalities again in order for governments to be able to have a different toolbox? And how do we make that, of course, in the multilateral sector, but also within the borders? So that for me, it's a very practical a challenge and a very pragmatic limitation that we have to account for, because it's not going to be as easy as just deciding it as we think it could be from academia. And my second thought is about geopolitics and more like dependency, the theory of dependency. So we, at the beginning of this conference, we saw all those measurements about how countries will be located in this chart or inside or outside the green area. But what I think it's always very invisible is the relationships that are created between the fact that one country can, let's say, enter the green chart at the same time as other country is actually living away from the green chart. So there is a relationship between who enters and who goes further away, and that's the theory of dependency, and that's the colonial legacy that we have to be very conscious of as well in relation to the green growth and the post-growth and all the debates that we are having here. One debate or one example of that kind of tension is the rush for critical minerals. So we are talking about electrification and just energy transitions, and we all need more electrification, and there is more energy demand, green energy demand in Europe, and for that we need wiring, and the wiring is coming from, the copper is coming from the global south. And it's impossible that the copper won't come from the global south. Copper and lithium for the batteries, and even if Europe gets to get greener, it will mean that the environmental conflicts, because or pushed by the mining frontier, are going to be bigger in the global south, in our countries. So if that kind of correlation is not being approached, then we are being blind to a big elephant in the room. And that is supposed to happen in the multilateral spaces, no? In the summits, in the climate summit, in the sustainability summit, in the biodiversity summit. But I think with the elections that just happened yesterday, what is gonna result as more crisis in the multilateral sector. So what are going to be the spaces in which we can then discuss those kinds of more beyond the national borders agreements? And if we don't have those common spaces where to debate and where to take decisions that are global, then everything else is, for me, a little bit still very Eurocentric and leaving the global south behind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Torres, especially for bringing to this space that insight you have from lived experience about the patience, the time it takes to turn things around from within an administration that is walking into a legacy from multiple centuries. And I think that often gets missed for people outside of these spaces who aren't aware with the machinations of how governments around the world perhaps work. Yes, Dr. Hiepe. And in fact, no, I think that Dr. Pheko is going to try join us, and I'm trying to keep her up to date with the conversation as well. And then we'll come to you, Dr. de Schutter. But if Dr. Pheko joins us, we'll ask her to share first, given the challenges she's having. But for now, Dr. Hiepe.
Yes, I think that was really rich, the contributions of previous speakers. Let me pick up on 2 points which triggered me. One was the connection by Lebohang to the post-colonial debate. I think it's really important to make this link. And this is also very much a discussion. So within BMZ, for example, we have really a big process on post-colonial development policy, and where we are debating internally, what does this mean? And we are discussing topics like how to further step up direct financing of IPLCs for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation, mitigation, things like that. But what do we don't want to do more? How can we work even better in partnerships and etc. So I think it's very important to connect this to the post-colonial debate. And the other point that triggered me was, I think, Olivier, you said it very clear, the beyond GDP agenda. It's important, but it may actually prevent the real shift. So in that context, I think it would be very interesting for me to get your views, actually, on the UN system on environmental economic accounting, because that is something I think it can be very powerful if we really, many countries working on this. We have been supporting this also for a long time, also through the UN system, through the World Bank, that environmental information gets into not only statistical reports, but really informs macroeconomic policies and planning, and the adjustment of those economic models that really at the macro level that inform those policies. So I think it's a powerful tool, but would be interested to know if there are critical voices on that. And last point on the common goods. Yes, I think this is key, that also for development cooperation, that we are helping to create the regulatory, the frameworks, the policy frameworks, the institutions that enable local communities and, for example, IPSCs to fulfill this role as land stewards, and this means things like land tenure, etc. Full stop.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hiepe, for raising this. If I'm right, I think you used to work in the UN system at some point. Is that correct? Yes. So I want to pick up on that point that you're asking for Dr. de Schutter about the UN system for environmental accounting. And I'm grateful also for you picking up Dr. Pheko's point about post-colonial narratives. And I'll add in that there's also post-development narratives. There's strong global South-led movements around alternatives to development. So lots of spaces for us to expand and widen the lens, as Dr. Gillian Marcel often uses in terms of language. Dr. de Schutter, you have your hand raised, so I'll pass over to you.
Well, thank you. I look forward to hearing what Dr. Pheko will have to say. No, just a couple of reactions. First, I think it's really important to realize that Not all countries, of course, are situated alike. But the interdependencies in this world are such that it's very difficult to think about degrowth in the global north as it must happen, whilst development in the global south must continue at the same time. And so what we need is not only different recipes for different countries, different pathways towards improving people's lives, but also to escape these interdependencies by what I would like to call pathway thinking. We cannot all at once cut off the links between South and North and how trade relationships are organized, but we can gradually reduce this dependency on exports of the development of low-income countries in particular. And in that sense, I'm a bit concerned that the Pact for the Future, for example, adopted a bit more than a month ago at the Summit for the Future, still refers to export-led development for developing countries, which I think is at the very best oversimplifying the issue and certainly not looking forward towards how the development of low-income countries and developing countries more generally can be encouraged without this having to rely on infinite growth of economies in the rich countries that are already obese. And my second reflection is that all that we discussed today concerning degrowth, post-growth approaches, critiques of development, must be replaced against the background of a situation in which 64 countries in the global south are basically bankrupt, unable to refinance the loans they take on financial markets because it's becoming too expensive for them. 3.3 billion people on earth live in countries that spend more on debt servicing than they can on healthcare or education. And it is because of this high level of debt that many countries are forced into a growth pattern that is actually post-colonial, that is extractive and exploitative. They grow perhaps, but they grow because they tolerate an exploitation of their workforce in low-wage jurisdictions. They grow because they accept that their subsoils will be digged for minerals to finance or to support the greening of the economies in the global north. And they grow because they produce raw agricultural commodities at a low price for global markets. And that is simply not sustainable. So we need to accept that given these interdependencies and these lock-ins, we need an action plan, a multi-year action plan, so that we should distinguish between what actions can be taken within 2-3 years, within 5 years, within 10 years. And that is exactly the kind of action plan that with my team we are preparing. We are now seeking from unions, NGOs, academics, a number of proposals that we rank depending on whether they're short-term, mid-term, long-term, in order to have a credible strategy for post-growth futures to be developed based on these policy proposals that are made concerning different areas of economy and society. And I think that is what we need to be aware of. We cannot change everything at once. That doesn't mean that we are to be forced into this status quo and into this inertia in the system. Now, what is true, and I thank you for this question, Donnie, is that apart from the major international conferences that will take place next year, the 4th International Conference for the Financing for Development and the 2nd World Summit for Social Development, next year there will also be a revision of the national accounting system, which is basically how the UN harmonize how GDP is calculated across countries. And I think it's a hugely important discussion, what counts and what does not count in how we measure countries' economic performance. So I will also contribute to that debate, highly technical, highly important, and that deserves to be more politicized, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schutter, and thank you for raising this issue of debt and the indebtedness that can also be linked, of course, to Dr. Pheko's comments earlier about reparations, etc. I'll be so bold as to add that At the Post-Growth Institute, our research has shown that in any form of capitalist system, you will see aggregate debt increase. And so I think there's questions here that perhaps even go beyond in terms of what dependencies look like, even in situations where we're seeking to reorient around export orientation mandates or pressures, etc., to service global north markets, these sorts of things. But for now, I want to just check as well. Unfortunately, Dr. Pheko has had to go to her next engagement, so won't be rejoining us. But I just wanted to follow up on Dr. Hiepe's question for you, Professor de Schutter, about the UN system for environmental accounting. Is there anything you'd have to add about that? We may have frozen in time there. So we'll circle back to that perhaps in the Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, let's again take 15 seconds of silence to just reflect, see what questions you might have bubbling up. We've got about 40 minutes here, and I always like to really give audiences a chance to connect with the speakers and vice versa. We've got an online audience that's joining us. Hello. If you have questions or comments that you'd like to share, please put those in the chat now. And we'll take 15 seconds to just reflect in silence to see if there's anything bubbling up, and then we'll move to the Q&A section. So what I might do first is privilege those online who have been patiently with us during these moments and see, do we have some questions or comments from the online audience? I believe so. So let's maybe take 2 questions at a time, and we'll take 2 from the online space. There's a little red button at the bottom. There you go.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, great. Okay, so it was more like the online space, they more had like some clarification questions. One directed to Ms. Torres, asking whether, so basically that the Colombian economy is based on 2 features, the first one being extractivism. However, this person couldn't understand the second feature, whether she could re-elaborate on the second feature. And then there was another clarification question, if there's any more information on this accounting process that has just been mentioned. But that's it so far.
Okay, so given it might be just the 2 people on the stage who are with us for now, we'll give you each a chance to answer those questions consecutively.
My point was that one feature of our history is governmental extractivism, which means the way we have designed the national policies and the institutions surrounding and protecting extractivism as a material flow of energy and wealth. And the second, then, it is the dependency on the carbon-intensive commodity exports. So basically, one thing is the way we design the state, and we have designed the state. And the other thing is the way the political economy of materials and energy have been established. So those 2 are very complementary, and to escape those frameworks is what has been shown very difficult and what we have been struggling against.
Thank you. And Dr. Hiepe?
Yes, I take the accounting question because I raised it, and actually the colleague, the UN rapporteur, he also answered it in a way. That he said he also thinks it's very important, and that there will be an update, a revision next year. So I think this is related to the UN standard on system SEEA, System of Environmental Economic Accounting. And this is, has been established for quite some time, but only a few years ago, the system of ecosystem accounting, has been added. So since that, and many countries are still in the process, some have already adopted it. So really many countries all over the world are adopting this standard. Some have already adopted also the ecosystem accounting, which means spatial maps, etc. of natural resources, and others have not yet, are still working on it. And this is really important because it means that the accounting, that really informs macroeconomic policies, etc., will then count on these other data on natural assets, etc. And this can really inform important policy and investment decisions. If I can actually quantify what does it bring my economy to keep this let's say, conservation area standing and use it for tourism and other ecosystem services that will be provided by this conservation area versus converting this for some other economic activity, etc. No? So this is a way to internalize those environmental issues that are usually externalized at a system of the country economy. So it's a macro instrument.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hiepe. We'll take 2 questions or comments from the audience now, and there'll be a roving microphone, I believe. Feel free to introduce yourself by way of your name and any affiliation if you'd like. So let's just see if you'd raise your hand. We've got someone in the back there, if you wouldn't mind. There's a person in the back with a colourful top, and then we'll take this one down here.
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Donnie. I work for the UN Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD. Thank you, first of all, for the really insightful panel and interesting contributions. I have a question for Dr. Torres, because I thought it was really great to hear sort of a first-hand experience of what it's like to change these systems. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the point you alluded to on communities and basically the engagement with people, no? Because I imagine that's really difficult along the way. And you already mentioned how important like an identity can be linked to things like coal or other types of extractivism. So I'd be really keen to hear a little bit more on how you've basically designed that process to ensure that people are taking along. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take this one more question, which is down at the front here in the purple top.
Thank you so much. Hi to everyone. I'm Irene Stefano from the Wuppertal Institute. 2 short questions, but like big question here. Then, how is possible then to change the goal of the economic system? Okay, so what kind of like steps we should take at local and global level? First one. And second one, is it possible just for a city or country to be like by design post-growth in an environment which is not like post-growth? That's like possible, that's like sustainable in some way? Good, thanks.
Thank you. So maybe if Dr. Torres, if you want to address the first question, and then either of you could pick up those second questions.
Thank you very much for the question. What we decided is to bring the voices of people into the design of policies. So we, for example, in designing the National Development Plan that is always made at the beginning of each government, we went to do more than 200 workshops engaging with more than 5,000 people from all the geographies in the country. And we were trying to make sure that people will be heard by the government for the first time. So that's, in terms of the method, that's already a change. Now, it was then possible to make like a systematic organization of those ideas and to translate it into the policies. It was more difficult to translate those aims into indexes, as I just said before. So many things that the people were imagining were very difficult to actually make into something that we will follow up or that will correspond exactly with what we have been doing for centuries before. But besides that, which is more in the policy design, I will say that in terms of the just energy transition, it was crucial to engage with people that were living in extractivist areas, as well as labor unions that are like the labor unions of the extractive industries. And there were not easy conversations because, of course, the unions are very much concerned about their own futures. But it was crucial to be there and to build with them the labor transitions, for example, and how to imagine labor transitions and how much time do they need to requalify the workers, for example, and towards what kind of new economies and what kind of new industries. And we also did the same with the local communities that are embedded in extractivist industries in their territories. So trying to imagine with them how will this territory look in 10 years, for example. What I think it's crucial is to put on the table who and how is that transition going to be financed. Because in the case of local communities, for example, yes, they could see it if we work together, if they see that the government is committed, and but then the investment that is needed not only to substitute the economy, but to remediate the damage that the extractive industries have created in the territories. It's so much that a government like Colombia cannot do it with its own means. So we were exploring, for example, for one particular location that has for 30 years exploded coal for actually Germany and the Netherlands and some other countries that have been importing our coal for many years. So we were trying to find the financiation of those projects, and the only financiation possible was debt. And we are already indebted enough. So what are then the possibilities that are there to make the transition? Very, very minimal. So the practical restrictions are huge, and I think are very much under the radar of this whole debate. And this is what I think we should be discussing also at the multilateral levels.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. I'll just share also a brief little point that builds on this. There's a very interesting case. It wasn't successful ultimately, but perhaps not for economic reasons, out of Virginia in the USA, where a not-for-profit foundation that was working in remediation, so some of the things you're alluding to here, actually bought out 8 active mines. And what they did was they tried to work out a transition plan over multiple decades for the labor force while continuing the mine's activities, but offsetting with their existing biodiversity and restoration work the carbon footprint associated with that. But it was an integrated approach that I hadn't seen in places around the world. It's not typical you see a non-profit buying mines, for example. So just thinking about creative possibilities that exist. In terms of this follow-up questions, would either of you, yes, Dr. Hiepe.
I mean, also maybe starting with the first question too, this is very similar to our experience with the Just Energy Transition Partnerships that BMZ is very engaged in. And I think a key point there is one aspect is really continuous stakeholder engagement. I mean, and really serious stakeholder engagement. So that is also aligned with BMZ's feminist development policies, the 3 Rs, the rights, the resources, and the representation. And this is, so the workers, they have to be with the whole process from the beginning to understand to jointly look at other pathways to be reskilled, to have social protection schemes, whatever. So, and the whole process has to be the stakeholder engagement. This is just to add on the first question. So on the second question, is it possible to have a city or country be post-growth in a growth environment, right? That is the question. I mean, it depends on, this is all about definitions, I guess. But in a way, I certainly think elements of it are possible. Like if we take Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia with the Bon Vivir really established at the government level. No, this is also an element of looking at showing social well-being and harmony with nature at the highest level of the government as the overall vision guiding the country, the government. So that for me is this automatic post-growth? Probably not, but it's element of this, and cities can do the same. They can. So I think that in a way it's possible. It depends on what we understand about it, and of course it's also possible at the very local level. And also there are these millions of local initiatives, post-growth initiatives all over the world in a growth environment. And this, it is possible. Maybe that's the short answer. I think it's possible.
Thank you. Dr. Torres, anything you want to add to that? Or? Okay. And of course, I might add, given the work we do at the Post-Growth Institute in this regards to this question, we're focusing a lot here on government. And of course, there are lots of things that happen with respect to economic growth dependencies outside of government in terms of informal economy, the expansion of that, the support for the care economy, demonetization of relationships, centering relationality, and within forms of cooperative business, etc. Welcome back, Dr. de Schutter. I'm glad we were decreasing at a rapid rate, degrowing the size of our panel here, and I was worried I was going to be left alone. So we're just going through some questions, and it's perfect timing because we're going to return to the questions online, and I'm going to take one question from online and then one from the audience here. Is there another question or a comment online? No. Okay, so that means we get two questions from the audience here. I think I saw a hand here, so we'll take one from here, and we'll take this person's question next or comment. Here we go.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Bernd Ludermann. I'm editor-in-chief of a magazine called Weltsichten, and I have a question to Ms. Torres. I'm very grateful for this stimulating discussion, but after what you said in your last answer, I'm wondering, does the Petro government actually need GDP growth in order to finance its budget and also to serve its debt, not only external but also internal debt? Thanks.
Thank you. So we'll take that on note. And then there was someone just down here, and then we'll come to you in the next round. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Tommaso Luzzati. I'm an economist from University of Pisa. Just a very brief questions or comment to Mr. de Schutter. So, how are still the contributions of Gunnar Myrdal or Carl William Kapp relevant? So, because my impression is that we forget, we tend to forget very relevant contributions and policy proposals, and we rediscover every time the hot water. So, if you can comment on that.
Thank you. We'll take that in just a moment, but first we'll go to Dr. Torres in response to this question.
Our biggest challenge at the moment is to replace the royalties that come with oil and coal. And those royalties are precisely the ones that serve to pay the debt. And our debt is increasing, and it is increasing not because we are right now materializing the transitions, as I just mentioned, but because the former government induced a very big debt that we still have to respond to. So yes, we need to replace that income, and the way to do it, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been by incentivizing tourism, ecological tourism, trying to speed up industrialization, which is very difficult to speed up. I mean, if anything, industries are slow, and because it needs big investment, and it needs like the financial securities and the tax exemptions and all that, then it's not easy to speed up. And to incentivize green energy, which is something that we are trying to do. But again, one of the paradoxes, if we want, is that not all green energies are actually democratized or are actually for the local people or for the profit that is generated is not necessarily beyond corporations. So as not really the growth that is happening there is not necessarily distributed with local communities. So again, there is this gap of new industries, in this case green industries, coming into territory is not necessarily solving the inequalities that have been built for many decades and centuries. So yes, we need substitution, but we are still struggling to find it in the speed that we need to.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Living in Argentina myself, I resonate deeply with this inheritance issue of an existing debt and royalties just essentially going unsuccessfully to paying down that debt. Over to Dr. de Schutter for the question that was posed there.
Well, thank you for this question. It's I think true that in the 1970s, there were many ideas that were very bold and original, and the parenthesis of those bold proposals concerning development trajectories was largely closed following the debt crisis of the early 1980s and the wave of structural adjustment policies imposed on heavily indebted developing countries in the 1980s. And in fact, that also meant the end of the debate on the new international economic order that reached its apex in 1974 when the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution including the Charter on Economic Rights and Duties of States, for example, and proclaimed sovereignty over natural resources and other such very promising commitments during that time. I would say, however, that even then, even under the new international economic order agenda, and when economists in the 60s and 70s put forward proposals for an alternative agenda for development, growth was still very central and not really questioned. Of course, it was a different type of growth, stimulated by different means, but the need to invest in infrastructure by increasing the capital available in developing countries was still very present in those discussions. So we need something else today. And I think what we need is two things. First, to address the interdependencies being between South and North, resulting from the way trade relations organized and the debt servicing burden. One way to do this, for example, is to reward countries who invest in social investment, in social protection floors, for example, by debt alleviation measures. I'm now working on the idea of debt for social protection swaps, basically debt forgiveness and debt restructuring in exchange of a commitment of countries to provide better income security for their population by establishing social protection floors. And I think there is much more future in debt for social protection swaps than there is in debt for nature or debt for climate swaps, for example. And the second thing we must do is to identify ways we can finance development without depending on growth. Today, most resources that states can mobilize come from taxing income of workers, of corporations. In other terms, countries depend on growth and on the healthiness of corporations in particular in order to finance the services they owe to their population. We can do things differently. We can finance public investment by taxing wealth rather than income, by taxing immovable assets and financial assets much more heavily, and reducing taxes on income of workers in order to have a way of financing public services that is much less dependent on the infinite pursuance of growth with all the ills that this brings about. And I think it was Herman Daly that described this as uneconomic growth, the point at which growth creates more disadvantages than it provides benefits. So that is, I think, the kind of new agenda we are facing. And I may be wrong, but I do not think that Gunnar Myrdal, for example, was really thinking beyond growth.
Thank you, Dr. de Schutter, and thanks for raising the debt for social protection swaps. I do think it raises questions about whether that becomes a new form of structural adjustment in terms of the relations there, and I think there's interesting questions that raises in terms of how does that line up alongside reparations, for example. At the moment, I think there was a response to follow up, so Dr. de Schutter, Professor de Schutter.
Thank you, Donnie. This is especially gracious of you since I'm going to respond to you directly. I really think we should avoid seeing debt for social protection swaps as re-establishing the kind of conditionalities that have left such important scars in the developing countries' economies from the 1980s on. Debt for social protection swaps basically are an opportunity for countries to be supported financially, to be rewarded for investing in their population, healthcare, unemployment benefits, child allowances, and so on. It is the exact opposite of the kind of conditionalities the IFIs impose, and it is a way to create the conditions for future prosperity in those countries, as it will encourage more investment in human capital. And debt for social protection swaps are a way to, again, reward countries that make these social investments, when today they are penalized. Today, when a country spends more on education or healthcare, the rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and indeed the financial markets will penalize that country by imposing higher interest rates on a country whose deficits increase as a result of making these investments. So I would really take issue with the idea that we are actually turning towards a form of solution that is really creating the conditionalities of the past. I would argue is the exact opposite. And my work is really for the benefit of the populations and certainly not for that of financial markets.
Thank you for that important clarification, Dr. de Schutter. Yes, we have a question here.
Okay. Thank you to everyone on the panel for their insights. My question was more on the lines of, so for instance, in the case of Colombia, we saw how there was a more governmental institutional push towards shifting to a local economy. But in a lot of developing countries, India, for instance, the ideals for growth are still quite infrastructure-led, where the push for a just transition or a green transition is not necessarily from the government, it's from non-governmental institutions. So in such cases, how do you see the transition sort of shaping up in the future? Just some insights.
Thank you for that, and we'll take a final question or comment here. If you just pass that, there we go.
Hi, my name is Vanja Flechner. I'm an economist from the University of Siegen. So I'm afraid we haven't talked about voters in the global north yet.
About what, sorry?
We haven't talked about voters in the global north yet.
Vultures?
Voters.
Oh, voters. Thank you, sorry.
Professor Hornich started this morning with, mentioning the election results in the US, but we also have, populism, parties who tell voters that climate protection is not a problem, increasing numbers of people do not support redistribution or climate protection and so on. You know what I'm talking about. So I wonder how this I think that we at the technical level we have quite, relatively speaking, quite good ideas of how to implement policies and so on and so forth. But how do we square this with the political sphere?
Thank you. So we'll just take that first question first, and would anyone like to pick this up? Yes, Dr. de Schutter, Professor de Schutter.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's an important question, and it is true that we have this view sometimes expressed that given the rise of populism, we should reduce the role of democracy in order to allow decision-making to be guided by the definition governments give to the general interests or the public interests. I think this is deeply wrong. The problem is that we have been thinking about democracy with respect to the state, and we should democratize not just the state, but also society and the economy. If corporations were better controlled by the workers and not simply acting for the short-term benefits of shareholders, if the economy were accountable to the people rather than responding to the expectations of markets alone, then the picture would be very different. And I think democratizing economic decision-making, democratizing the economy, starting with giving a greater voice to workers in corporations, but then also democratizing the shaping of macroeconomic policies and fiscal reforms is, I think, most important. These debates all too often have been led by technocrats based on often outdated economic models and oversimplified views of how human activity works. And I think we need much more democracy rather than less in order to hold accountable decision makers also for the decisions they take in those spheres. So I would say that the answer to the rise of populism is to make democracy present where it is today absent, in order to allow governments to regain control of markets and of the direction in which financial markets in particular impose countries to evolve.
Thank you, Professor. Anybody else want to pick up on that thread before we move to the related comment and question here? Or feel free to just move straight over. Dr. Torres first.
I think the questions and the answer by Dr. Professor de Schutter are very much connected. I am often very pessimistic about what are the real possibilities to materialize change when it is only made at a local civil society space. I was then very hopeful when a left-wing government came into power in my country, and I thought, okay, this is going to be our possibility to actually make those agendas into a more hegemonic political agenda that could make change. And then we have been struggling with a lot of frustrations, because not even being in the government, it has turned easy. President Petro says, we have the government, but we don't have the power. And then the question is, where is the power? And I think Professor de Schutter is calling for something that is very relevant. The power may still be in the people, but how is the people being informed, and with what kind of frameworks to take decisions and to form their own opinions and to form their own power that is happening? And I wonder what is the role of Twitter before, and what is the role of fake news, and how is all that actually making configuring the possibilities that we have for change. Yet I do think that there is a space of maneuver, and where is that space? I think we have to struggle for a change in corporations. I have a very specific example. When we were talking in Colombia about democratizing, then we did it with the locals. That was very good. With the unions, it was possible, even not from the beginning, but the agenda was growing into embracing those changes and challenges. We were trying to change institutions, but corporations are blind, are deaf to these debates. So we were sitting with corporations, trying to explain corporations the concept of democratization of wealth. No, that was completely out of it was incommensurable to what the values of corporations are. And I think in that sphere, we have a lot of pedagogy to make, and we have a lot of power to claim back. because it cannot be that corporations are defining the local settings of industrialization, and the national policies, and are lobbying the governments, and are lobbying the UN, and are lobbying the summits, and there are no values changing in them, and they are continuously accumulating, and their profit is continuously growing. That's actually growing and is not going anywhere. So I think we have to fight that kind of structures. And having said that, I think, and going into Professor de Schutter's reflection about the swaps, which I find very relevant, because I don't think climate action swaps are enough, because the Global South needs more than just stopping the emissions. We need a justice and more equalized system and public services and all that. How do we transform the international financial system? So we are talking about swaps, but what banks are really interested in giving away what they are expecting to be receiving? What national banks are what governments and their national banks are able to actually leave the Global South countries to invest in something else but paying back the debt. And I think that's an agenda that has to be taken from in the Global North, because it is the Global North society, the one that can pressure for that change, and that's the only change that could at some point generate like a global justice in a geopolitical perspective.
Thank you so much. Speaking of change, we are getting close to changing sessions to our poster sessions. So is there anything you'd like to add in response to these last questions at the moment, Dr. Hiepe? Yes, and then we'll just do a 1 minute from each of the panelists to close us out.
Yes, I keep it short. So on the question, answer to populism, I couldn't agree more that the answer is more democracy and not less, in democratizing the structures. On the other question, how the political narrative and how can we move away from the infrastructure-led focus to a more green vision, etc. So I think it's happening. Of course, the problem always is it's too slowly. Yeah? But I'm sometimes optimist and sometimes pessimist. So when I think it is good news that, for example, the MDB reform and the international financial architecture is greening, and that greening the financial system, that a lot of things are happening, that there is the new MDB vision, etc. But still, yeah, it's not enough, but there are many at the international level. I think many of small successes, like even there was the G7 Development Minister Summit recently, and in the infrastructure section of the document, nature-based solutions are the importance of nature-based solutions is recognized. So advocating for, it doesn't have to be the big infrastructure. No, can we not also see nature-based infrastructure or hybrid infrastructure? I mean, all these little pieces. I think a lot is happening there, and this is gradually, I hope, moving things. And but yeah, and the second point I want to make, that I really also think we need a shift in education and the university system. Yeah, all these economists that are still educated, maybe with the old economic paradigms, this also has to change. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. And so just to close out, I'm just going to ask each of the panelists a single question, which is what specific change, maybe if there's one specific change that you'd like to see in institutions that you've perhaps been involved in, or feel free to point to other institutions globally or in your own countries. What's one change that you would like to see in the coming decade? I'm going to start with Professor de Schutter and then run down the line and close us out.
Thank you very much, Donnie. So I think we need something else than just utopias as to what vision we want to pursue for the future. We need to do that, but we also need a sequence of steps towards achieving that. Otherwise, we'll remain trapped between the realistic management of everyday challenges and crisis responses, and the development of long-term visions that will remain utopian forever. And so that is what I'm trying to build. It's this roadmap, this multi-year action plan to provide a plan B, basically, to the current status quo. In this plan B, and I answer your question here, I think one major element, and I fall back on what Dr. Hiepe just said, is the need to reinvest in social capital. Social capital, I mean by this in the meaning of the sociologist Robert Putnam, is what brings us together. The cement of society, the social links that allow people not to feel alone and abandoned, and instead allow them to feel part of the community. And the social capital is important because it will allow each and every one of us to be valued by something else than the level of income or the wealth we accumulate. And I think at the heart of our ecological crisis and the crisis of inequalities, there is an anthropological crisis, a cultural crisis. We are without meaning in life, and people seek solace in accumulating stuff. And I think that is essentially the battle we must fight. It's also, therefore, not just a political battle. It's not just a battle about which macroeconomic policy we need to pursue or fiscal reforms. It's also a battle about culture and values. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schutter, and thank you for building social capital here with us by joining us from On the Road today. Dr. Hiepe.
Yeah, so we were talking about what do we want to see with the institutions, right? So I think my vision would be, well, that the vision of the socio-ecological transformation is actually that also not just remains a vision, that it's actually being implemented at every corner of these institutions. And this, of course, will also mean fundamental change in the way we work. It has started away from small projects and really working more holistic and wider approaches, but still to be done. So I hope in some years' time, this will be at the core, the social ecological transformation of the economy and society, and ecological sustainability, inclusiveness, and resilience will be taken serious and will be core business and not maybe only the vision, but when we look inside, then it's only some examples we have.
Thanks, Dr. Hiepe. And Dr. Torres to conclude.
I think something that's crucial is, of course, to change the way institutions are measuring everything, measuring their own success, their own progression, their difference as compared to last government and to former governments. But I don't think changing variables is enough. I also think that it's crucial to change what I call the culture of institutions. There is, particularly in the global south, I think institutions have inherited the colonial legacies and the very hierarchical and impositive and power and a lot of control over societies and over local imaginations and local alternatives. And I think part of the revolution that we need in the institutions is how do we change that culture and how we make institutions more humbled and how we make national and international institutions that are based in solidarity and where, for example, genocide is not any longer accepted. And that kind of values have to be at the core of government and institutions as well, and not because institutions are not only technical, they are also the symbols of society, and that those symbols have to change dramatically.
Thank you so much. Yes, please. Thank you so much to all our panelists and to Dr. Pheko as well, who was with us at the beginning. I've been in this field for 20 years, and 20 years ago, I could not have imagined that we would have a former Minister for Mines and Energy, someone from the German government, someone from the United Nations systems, and a political scientist from the Global South talking about these things, entertaining the possibilities at the peripheries in the conversation in the way that you did. So thank you for accepting the invitation. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for the great questions, comments, and I'm going to now pass over to our MC/hosts to tell you what's coming next.